We will never turn our back on a single Scot.
We've got to wrestle with those challenges.
This is the same nonsense we have heard time and time again.
This is our country. Let's fix it together.
Hello and welcome to a special episode of Planet Holyrood. I'm Paul Hutcheon, political editor of the Daily Record. Joining me for an extended chat is the former Labour MSP Paul O'Kane. Paul was a Labour MSP for the West Scotland region between 2021 and 2026, latterly becoming his party's Shadow Cabinet Secretary for Education and Equalities. He stood again on May 7th, both in a constituency and on the same regional list, but fell short and was not re-elected. Thanks for joining us, Paul.
Thanks for having me, Paul. Good to see you.
So it's the two Paul show, I think. I think there's a lot to talk about. So let's just start with your own campaign and just from your own personal perspective. Did you ever feel like during the campaign that you personally were going to win, that you were going to get re-elected? Or deep down, did you just feel this is not happening?
Do you know, I think with the benefit now of a couple of weeks of hindsight, you do a lot of reflecting about all aspects of the campaign, but I always knew it was going to be a challenge, but we ran an excellent campaign. We had really strong returns, I think it's fair to say. We had a good sort of tactical vote message, actually, in the communities where we needed to do that. I think what's unfortunate is something went wrong in terms of the data and understanding probably where the SNP vote was and where the Reform vote was coming from. Because, I mean, Reform in my constituency came from nowhere to 5,000 votes. Now, there was a sense that that was probably going to happen. But I suppose the reality is, people who were undecided, I reckon, were probably, there was an element of shy Reform and there was an element of people who were sticking SNP but just weren't saying it. So I think there's a huge piece of work to be done to understand all of that. There were definitely days where I thought we were going to win, and we had really, really positive conversations and responses. And as I say, our numbers looked right. There were days in my head where I thought maybe this is just too much of an ask, and actually that the national polling is probably accurate. So yeah, I think all of that in the mix, Paul, and all of that to be analysed and understood.
Was it pretty obvious as soon as the boxes opened that you weren't going to make it?
The sample was probably quite varied. So there were real areas of strength where we thought there would be areas of strength, particularly in the Leven Valley, which is sort of Barhead Neilston, where I come from, where we won the council by-election last year. Again, areas where we got clearly a tactical switch from people in parts of Bridgeweir and Houston. But again, it just wasn't enough to probably counteract some of the communities where we saw a bigger SNP turnout than we had anticipated, particularly in places like Johnston and Linwood and those sorts of things. So for me, it became increasingly apparent, I think, to my team who were on the ground that it just wasn't going to be enough. Now, we fell about 3,000 short, which in the grand scheme of other places, wasn't as wide as other places. But, I think it became apparent very quickly. And I've got a great team who are very on it in terms of the numbers and very honest. So I was aware very quickly and was able to then get the game face on for the count, which is always part of the challenge.
Well, I've spoken to MSPs in the past who've lost their seats, and sometimes they feel disappointment, but others kind of weirdly feel a sense of liberation, maybe to be out of the Parliament and back in the real world. What are your sense? How do you feel now that you're no longer in the tent, as it were?
I do feel really disappointed. I completely respect the democratic process we've gone through and accept what the electorate have decided to do. And I congratulate the SNP on their victory and those who took the regional seats as well, because obviously that was what I was going for that as well, obviously. But no, I think I would be lying if I didn't say I was really disappointed. Disappointed not to have the opportunity to continue doing the work that I was doing on a whole range of issues, but also to work with colleagues both in the Scottish Labour Party and across the Parliament to try and affect change. And there's a human cost to all of it. So you will miss the people that you worked with. You will miss the opportunity to meet different people across the region and represent them. So there's all of that. But I think what I kind of fundamentally said at the when I lost the seat is that for me, politics will always be a cause. It's not a career. It's something that's hardwired into so many of us. It's about what we do in our communities. It's not about an elected office. And as hard as that is, and as painful as it is not to hold that elected office anymore, for me, politics will always be about what I can do in my community and nationally to continue a conversation about change and about the issues that I care about.
Now, there is an ongoing conversation about why did Labour get the result that they get on May the 7th? And, I've written about it, and I do subscribe to the view that the overwhelming reason was the UK government and just feeling of dissatisfaction with the Prime Minister, because I spoke to candidates that just came up over and over again, and candidates just couldn't get their own message out to voters. It was being drowned out by the noise coming from Westminster. Is that your general view, that the main factor behind Labour's defeat was the UK government?
I mean, I think undeniably a principal factor of the challenge that we faced was the Prime Minister, and the kind of the actions very often of the UK government. And I think that's been true actually of the build up to the campaign, and many of the errors that were made in the early days of that Labour government. It's been hard. We've probably been on the back foot a bit, ever since decisions like winter fuel were made and those sorts of things. So to me, it's very clear that was a huge challenge, and something that was really hard to sort of counterbalance. I mean, if you'd had sort of half an hour with every voter, you could have started to help them see, the differentiation that very often happened between the positioning of Scottish Labour and UK Labour, trying to have an in-depth conversation about the stance Anas took, for example, on the Prime Minister's future. But there was not enough time, and it was really hard to, I think, win the broader air war on a lot of that stuff. I mean, that said, Paul, I think whilst that is a principal factor, I think it would be wrong for us not to take time to have self-reflection in Scotland as well, and in the Scottish Party, about what happened in the campaign, about the way the campaign was run, about the decisions that were made around various issues of policy. So I wouldn't want us to, just see the issues with the UK government and the Prime Minister as a reason not to have a wider reflection and a wider piece of work that looks at all of the issues in the round, because I think there are issues as well that we need to explore.
So that's part of the reason for getting you on Planet Holyrood, because, as I said, there is this ongoing debate about the result. And the way it was put to me was that you can accept that the Prime Minister was a key factor in the defeat, but there were also problems with the campaign, and there must be an exercise or review looking at that. And certainly the people I've spoken to, they weren't very happy with the 38-seat strategy, elements of the manifesto and other bits and pieces. What would your reflection be on the campaign, and what could have been done better?
Look, I think with every campaign, I can't fault people's energy and enthusiasm, their dedication to the party, their dedication to me and candidates personally. But I do think there are, questions to ask about that sort of 38-seat strategy. Whether that was a strategy that could evolve with the changing picture of polling, whether it was a strategy that evolved looking at the sort of the way the campaign was shaping up as we got into the short campaign. For me, there are clearly questions about preparation for a list, the list element of the election, both in terms of the processes that were used to decide on candidates, the processes that were used then to decide on, did you run a list strategy campaign or not? So for me, there are questions about, because, regardless, you can have the best first past the post campaign in the world, but it's important in the system that we operate in that you have a list strategy that sits alongside that as a contingency, if you need it, because I suppose that's the way very often we look at the system. And I do have concerns that we didn't pivot enough, perhaps, or we didn't sort of reflect on that enough. And this is all for a wider conversation, I think. And it's really important that we have that wider conversation about the whys and the wherefores of all of that.
Do you feel like there was too much focus on the constituencies at the expense of having a proper list strategy? Because I may be wrong on this, but I think that in terms of the constituencies, Labour did have a higher vote share than on the lists. And, clearly they were punished for that.
Well, I think there's a degree to which, as I say, you have to have a campaign that sort of, there's a flexibility in it to sort of look at the way the system works, to look at all of these issues in the round, and to shift things as a campaign progresses. And my sense is there should have been more focus on the list strategy, and thinking about that more widely. I understand why we had that first past the post strategy and the learning that we took from the Hamilton by-election, for example. But I do think we will need to reflect on, could we have done more and should we have done more in terms of that regional list approach? Talking, for example, about the peach paper, talking about what that was for and why people should use it for Scottish Labour. Talking about some of those more regional issues. I think all of that was important and was probably lacking.
I mean, you're right. I mean, the other parties spoke endlessly about the peach ballot. It was almost comical, and it was getting pretty boring, but I don't really recall Labour doing that much. I think Anas Sarwar's view was that in order to become First Minister, they probably needed to win 15, 20 first past the post seats. But of course, when that doesn't happen and then you don't have a list strategy, then you're getting hammered both sides, aren't you?
I think it's the reality of the system, Paul, in that, that is absolutely correct. First past the post is such an important element of the system. We had clear empirical evidence from Hamilton that first past the post seat could be won, and there was clearly data that showed that we were competitive in a number of seats. The challenge, I think, for me is just, again, what was the contingency? What was the balancing factor? Because with the best will in the world, a lot of the national polling was starting to show that was quite a narrow path, the first past the post path, and that there would have to be a balancing effect in terms of the regional list. And I suppose my concern is that we didn't sort of begin to tune into that and help voters to tune into that, because I also think voters get really confused still about the system and how it works and why it works like that. And what you need to do is distill that down into pretty simple messages, which is what other parties did around repeating that point about the peach paper. And, I think we do need to reflect on why we didn't do more of that.
You alluded to the need for Scottish Labour to perhaps look in this review at how they select candidates. Now, just for Planet Holyrood listeners, I think you were 4th on the West Scotland list. That was despite the fact that you'd held big portfolios on social security, and then you were the shadow education. Do you still think that the selection process and the way they go about ranking the candidates is fit for purpose in 2026?
I mean, it's hard for me because I don't want to sit here and say like it's sour grapes and I'm going to blame process about me not being re-elected to Parliament. I respect the decisions that were taken and the system that was used. Obviously, there was a zipping system, so we have a gender balancing system, which essentially means that although I was 3rd, I was zipped into 4th place, and Katie came up above me. That's the system that was used, and I understand why that was. Again, though, I think just thinking about that counterbalancing of the list and that sort of contingency, if you like, I do think we could have looked at our processes, and I think this is part of the review and the conversation that needs to be had. And this is no disrespect to any colleague who is elected and who found themselves elected via the system, but I do think it's a conversation about And this has been a challenge for the party, I think, since the inception of devolution, is how do you use your list system alongside your constituency selections in order to have that balance and make sure that you don't lose people who are perhaps experienced. And actually, it was true for the SNP to some extent as well. I mean, some of their list selections, if they had required, a list contingency, if you like, we're knocking kind of well-established people down the list as well. So there's a question on all of that. I think the wider question as well, Paul, is the system. Is it still the right system 25 years into devolution that we're using? Because whilst it gives a sense of proportionality, which was the sort of the idea, there's a lot of criticism out there that says it isn't working in terms of being
the electoral system, the AMS that was used.
Sorry, say that again, Paul. I just missed that.
You mean the electoral system, the additional member system? That's what you're referring to.
Yeah. So obviously, there's now a lot of commentary around, is it still fit for purpose, or should we at the very least tweak it to make it a more balanced, more proportional system, giving people more options in terms of how they vote for candidates, perhaps more individually, or do we need to look at the whole thing more broadly? I mean, we use different systems now for every different election we have in Scotland. STV for council elections, for example. STV is something that is used at every level in Ireland, so everybody understands that every time they go to vote, they do the same thing. That's not what happens here. So there is definitely a question for me about selection processes, and I think that should form part of the internal conversation in the Scottish Labour Party, but there's also a bigger question here, I think, about the system we use.
Are you personally persuaded of maybe moving towards STV for the Scottish Parliament elections?
I'm definitely persuaded that we need to have a conversation about how the system works and whether we should, at very least, as I say, tweak AMS to make it a more efficient system and a more proportional system. I was elected twice to the council under STV. I think it is a good system. I think it's an understandable system for voters. As I say, it's used in Ireland for both Dáil Éireann and for their councils. So it's certainly a system that I would be interested in seeing move forward in the discussion, if that is indeed a discussion that we feel we're able to have at a national level.
Because I think there's no doubt that everyone knows that Labour, the party of devolution, they created the Scottish Parliament, and there was this consensus on that electoral system. But where we are just now, there is no doubt that it gives the SNP a structural advantage, because on those constituencies, you have essentially 4 pro-UK parties up against, I think, 1 1/4, the quarter being the Greens, because they don't field candidates in all of the constituencies. So do you think from that perspective, at least, there has to be a recognition that it's not exactly helpful to the pro-UK parties?
I think we have to recognise, I suppose, the bluntness of first past the post. I think it's a point you make there, though, about certain parties who don't run in constituencies and only run on the list. So, there is a criticism out there that is, there's a gaming of the system, or that the system isn't then as effective as a counterbalance to the bigger parties, if you like. So to me, there has to be an acknowledgement, I think, of all of that, and that we could find a way to better balance some of that. And the thing that used to really frustrate me, Paul, and still frustrates me, is this sort of 2-tier MSP thing that we get, where it's like, if you're a constituency MSP, you're somehow more legitimate than a regional list MSP. I mean, I used to, when certain people on my social media who supported the SNP used to hang out with that chat, I would say, so would you accept that when Nicola Sturgeon was a list MSP for 5-10 years, that she was illegitimate? And they just couldn't answer it, because it just is an easy place for people to go. But maybe we do just need to say, well, let's make all things equal then, even though I don't think there is an issue, but it's just about the people in people's heads. That's probably still what they think to some extent.
There's been criticism of the Labour manifesto, the policy offering, that it wasn't ambitious enough, it didn't go further enough, that Labour didn't really have policies that were landing, connecting with voters. What's your view?
Well, look, I think the manifesto was, I think it was trying to be honest with people to some extent around the challenges that this current government are going to face in terms of the public finances. I don't think it would be right to promise the earth and not deliver it, because I think that's been the story of 19 years of the SNP in power, and particularly in my brief that was education. People have been led up the garden path time and time again with just things that weren't delivered. So I think there was a realism to all of that. Do I think we could have probably been a bit more, probably ambitious and hopeful in our language? Yes. And when I took on the education brief, I was really keen that we had sort of clear and demonstrable things that people could point to as being an offer. And that's why you saw, teacher numbers referred to, particularly for pupils with additional support needs, pupil support assistants. I'm always loath to get into a sort of an election auction around numbers, but I think you need to do that to say to people, we actually have a plan to tackle things like violence in schools and additional support needs challenges. And here's a starter for 10, actually, in terms of how you might do that. So I think we probably could have done a bit more of that. But I just think, and maybe it wasn't the election to do it, but I do think there has to be a more honest conversation about how people are going to pay for things. And my criticism of the SNP throughout the campaign was that they made broad, sweeping assumptions about you can have childcare from zero to the end of the end of primary school or whatever it was. And I thought, yeah, but it's just an assertion. There is no plan behind that. Now, the SNP are back in government, so it's up to them to obviously deliver or not on that. But I think there was trying to read the mood of the country about the end of gimmicks, but perhaps we should have been more ambitious in our language.
Let's just take a sort of look at it from a longer lens in terms of Scottish Labour's performance over 27 years of devolution. So in every single election, Scottish Labour has fallen backwards. I think in the first Scottish Parliament election, they managed to win 56 seats, 56 MSPs under Donald Dewar. They've gone backwards every single election, and now they're on 17. How serious is the situation for Scottish Labour, given that long-term historical trend?
I mean, I don't think there's any getting away from the fact that the numbers that you present are a challenge, are worrying. We need, and it's why we need to have this fundamental conversation because right now there's a rawness to it and there is pain, and I think Anas referred to that. There's a pain, and we sort of need to kind of move through that. But then that's why we need to, when things settle, have a look really fundamentally at how things have gone over that longer period of time and why that is, and also how do you rebuild from that, and what is the purpose? So I don't think there's any getting away from that as well. So there's a kind of the immediate things which we talked about earlier. There's also those longer term challenges that need to be looked at.
Do you think that in terms of that sort of fundamental look at the party and those historical trends, that one thing that could be considered is this idea of an independent Scottish Labour Party for Holyrood elections?
I think as part of any wider review and sort of that process, I think everything should be on the table. I think it would be wrong if we sort of closed off ideas about how we might move forward. There is an element to which, and there's been previous developments on this. I remember, I'm old enough to remember the Murphy-Boyack review after 2011, which sought to actually begin a process of devolving more of those processes and procedures and the things that are important. For example, establishing a Scottish leader for the first time. But I think perhaps we saw that as an event, not a process, to borrow a phrase. And it's maybe devolution more widely, Paul, here, which is we are the party of devolution. We believe in devolution. We believe in devolution that progresses, but we probably didn't do that for our internal party structures, and actually we need to accept that in a devolved UK, that looking at more devolved structures to the Scottish Labour Party isn't necessarily a bad thing. And I would be keen, I think, in the learning process that we're about to undertake, I hope, that we look at what happens in other parts of the world, because it's not uncommon in other countries for there to be a sort of highly devolved or federal structure within political parties. And I appreciate this is like into the realms of sort of wonkery, but if you look at Canada, you look at Australia, that there are clearly very strong independent state parties that then sit within their national parliaments as a single group. And there are ways, I think, to explore a lot of that. And I don't think it would be right to not have an open discussion about that in the process.
How far could you go with that? Is it more devolution for Scottish Labour, more autonomy, or just basically a separate Scottish Labour Party that is pro-UK?
I mean, I think it's really about what is the purpose of doing these things. And, I think for me, it's about thinking, because we did differentiate very often in the campaign. So already, Scottish Labour were very clear that we would take separate positions on different issues. And I think that's okay. And I think that's healthy, actually, because that's the devolution process working. But of course, I think it comes down to how do you arrange how you vote within, for example, the House of Commons. So do you, as a Scottish group and as a Scottish party, decide that you will have a distinct and separate position to the point of voting differently? And that's the big question, I think, when it comes down to the politics of it. And my sense is that from places like Australia and elsewhere, you essentially agree to take the whip, if you like, of the party at a national level, and you're then part of the discussion and the determination about what that is. And perhaps we should be looking more at those processes as well.
I guess the issue for me is that if you're in Scottish Labour and you're fighting a devolved election, you really want to be judged on your own merits. So if you run a good campaign, you want to be rewarded for that. If you have a good manifesto, you want to be rewarded for that. Similarly, if you don't run a good campaign, you can understand why the voters will punish you. But it seems to me that right now, Scottish Labour is being judged in relation to UK Labour, things out with their control. And how do you get past that without just hoping for a more favourable UK political environment in 2031?
Yeah, and there's some fundamental questions in that about, I suppose what the UK government does and how it does it, and how we tell some of that story. And I think I started this conversation by saying, look, the Prime Minister was clearly an issue, and many of the decisions that were taken have been an issue. So, of course, we would have wanted this election to be about Scotland, and we tried to make it about Scotland and about those issues. But there's no getting away from the fact that it is difficult. I think that this, again, has to be a moment of reset, of reflection about how we operate in terms of the UK Labour government and Scotland, the Scottish Labour Party, how we can be more collegiate and how we can understand the impact the decisions and issues have more widely. So, yeah, I think that has to form part of ongoing discussions. Now, obviously, there are processes and things moving at a UK level, which have to kind of take their course. But of course, we have to think about how Scotland features and all of that.
Do you think that far-reaching sort of fundamental change is required for Scottish Labour to get them in a position where they could win a Holyrood election?
Look, I think there's a danger in all of this of kind of rushing into saying, oh, there are easy solutions or there are sort of wizard wheezes that are going to make things work really easily. I think it's about taking the time fundamentally to reconnect and to listen to what people have told us in this election, thinking about our processes, thinking about structures, but actually that's not what's going to determine 2031 and that. What's going to determine that is, are we connecting with people and are we connecting with Scots? Because this election, and we know this from the numbers, it was a loveless election. It wasn't a huge ringing endorsement of the SNP. You had the reform element. You had an element to the Greens. So it's about asking some pretty fundamental questions, Paul, about who are we, what are we for, how are we going to use the next 5 years to deliver on the priorities that we hear from the people and reconnect in those communities. And that's as true for a UK Labour government as it is for the Scottish Labour Party. But we need to take the time to do that. And quite aside from all the internal stuff, which is important to do, that's the most important point, is reconnecting with communities.
See that issue of who Scottish Labour stands for. So you look at the other parties. Reform stand for the scunnered and the angry. The Greens did really well amongst younger voters. The SNP have got a lock on a big chunk of the pro-independence vote. Do you think there's a sort of a question mark over who Scottish Labour stands for? That voters look at them and they're not quite sure if Scottish Labour are for them?
I had so many conversations over the course of the election, and I do all the time as a Labour politician. It is about building a coalition, and I think elections are always about building a coalition of people to come and support us. And there are elements on all of the people you just described that we need to win, that we did win to some extent, and we need to continue to win over. But fundamentally, we need to listen to all of those discrete groups and understand how we speak to them and how we respond to them. And those are that's the important bit of the data that needs to get captured, which is what were the conversations we were having on the doors with these groups of people, and how do we respond to that? Because clearly what they saw, they decided, actually, that's not for me, or that's not what I think is going to deliver for me. Now, again, you've got a UK element to that, clearly, and that's the debate and the discussion that's happening in the party at large, and there's a Scottish element to that as well. But it will, for me, be about a coalition of people. We will always have that important heritage of standing up for working people and working class communities, but actually, it's also about a wider coalition than that.
You've spoken in previous interviews about your Irish heritage. And if you look at Irish politics, I think we've spoken about this in the past. Irish politics has been dominated for so long by two nationalist parties, or at least was. And the Labour Party in Ireland never really managed to lay a glove on them. Are you worried that that's the way Scotland is heading, that there's sort of long-term decline for the Scottish Labour Party and overshadowed by the SNP?
I think there's definitely a danger in it becoming really entrenched into two polarizing sort of nationalisms, where then sort of the politics of working people, of aspiration, of supporting all of the things I've just spoken about gets lost and squeezed to a point where it becomes slightly irrelevant, which is, I think, what you see in Ireland. Of course, there's opportunity in that as well, about saying, actually, because of course, there is a sort of a waning, and there will be a waning, I think, of that sort of ultra-nationalism, and a sort of pulling back to people wanting something different. It's about what do we offer that's different, and how do we do that? And also, what's our role in the next 5 years in trying to be an opposition that's constructive, that sees the opportunities to make change and to deliver change, but holding the government to account at the same time. And sometimes the psyche of being able to shift to do some of that is quite challenging, and we need the time to sort of think about all of that.
And there's clearly still a big link between constitutional preference and voting behaviour on Holyrood elections. What did you make of the Glasgow Labour MSP Paul Sweeney's view that there should maybe be an agreed process for Indy Ref 2, as we have through the Good Friday Agreement in terms of a United Ireland?
I think there's a couple of things in that. And the first thing I would say is, I'm not sure this election told us that people are clamouring to know what that process is. I mean, I think those who are in favour of those arguments, and the SNP and John Swinney in particular, wanted to make it about that, but I'm not sure the verdict of the people is that we should quickly convene this constitutional convention to decide what the process is. So I'm not really sure why we as Labour would advocate for a process that I don't think is being demanded by the people. Because I think what we saw actually was people wanted action on the cost of living, education, the health service, all of those things. That said, do I think there is a space for a wider conversation and discussion about the UK as a whole in terms of its constitutional arrangements? Yes, I do. I think when we talked in the early days of this UK Labour government about rewiring Britain, about thinking about reform, looking at more regional and national devolution, looking at what are the processes around abolition of the House of Lords, all of those things I think are really important. And I think that should form the basis of a wider constitutional convention across the whole of the UK. And of course, if we want to, as part of that process, have a discussion about how we define future votes on a whole range of issues, including independence, then that should absolutely form part of that. But I'm not in a rush to have a Scottish-only conversation. And just on the Good Friday Agreement point, because there's been a lot of commentary in the last few days, indeed, about John Swinney's comments, I really do caution against trying to make a direct comparison between Scotland and Northern Ireland. And actually, as someone whose family come from that community and have been very involved in the politics of peace and of reconciliation, there is a danger of trying to draw a line between an agreement that was brought about to end a violent conflict where thousands of people died. It's not the same thing. And I think that, and again, sort of John Swinney's comments about Sinn Féin and that sort of approach, those two things are not the same thing. And identity is really complex. People's pain in that respect is very complex. So I don't think we should try and compare the two things as though it's some easy argument for Scottish independence. And also what I get really frustrated about is people in the SNP would say to me all the time, "Oh, Northern Ireland gets a sweetheart deal on Brexit, for example." And I said, but you're completely missing the fact that is a very, very different and difficult situation born of the pain of that conflict. So I really would caution the First Minister and others who think that's an easy comparison to draw.
A couple of final things, Paul. We've mentioned repeatedly about the disappointing result on May the 7th. Anas Sarwar says he wants to stay on. He hasn't really put a time scale on that. What's your view about Anas's future and a potential leadership contest?
Well, look, I want to be really clear about my respect for Anas, my admiration for him as a leader. His energy and enthusiasm, I think, shone through at all times, even in the difficult moments. And I think that he himself has said that what's really important right now is that the party is in pain and is in a period where it needs to reflect on what has just happened. And I think it is absolutely right that he leads that, and he wants to do that, which is important. As part of that bigger conversation that I hope that we have, obviously people will need to reflect individually on their position within that, and then we need to think about what is the future. So Anas has my support to do that and to lead us through that process, and he will have my support in terms of what he decides to do next. But again, I think everything has to be on the table here. I think that's what's important, and ensuring that we can then move forward to do many of the things that I've spoken about today.
Obviously, you're an ally of Michael Mara, who was returned in the northeast of Scotland. Do you think Michael has got what it takes to be leader one day?
Look, I don't want to get into speculation of a contest that doesn't exist. And as I said, I think it's really important that the leadership have a job to do and to move us take those steps forward. I've had the pleasure of serving with lots of talented colleagues. Michael is obviously a very good friend. He's clearly someone with excellent abilities and a passion for both the Scottish Labour Party and for Scotland. So obviously, if we get into those scenarios, those are the sorts of discussions that we will want to have about measuring who puts themselves forward and how they can contribute to the wider issues we've talked about today. What I would say is right now, though, as well, Paul, it is a very new group. So again, I suppose a symptom of the way that selections were organised and those sorts of issues. We have a very, very new group, which is very fresh. There is, benefits to that, having come into a fairly refreshed group in 2021. But there will be challenges to that as well. So we need to think about how do we ensure that we lever in all the skills and all the talents of the party at all levels, and really allow that broad sort of pool of talent and ideas to come forward, because I think that's going to be really important in this next period.
I mean, you were an MSP for 5 years. I've talked about some of the portfolios that you held. Did you enjoy working in the Parliament, or did you find it a frustrating place to work?
It was, it's not an exaggeration when you say it is such a great honour to be elected to the Scottish Parliament and to engage with your constituents and on all the issues that are really important. I loved every single day. I did, and even on the bad days, it was that real sense of being an honour. Do I think that the Parliament was at its best over those 5 years? No, not always. Do I think we missed a lot of opportunities to actually focus on the priorities of the people of Scotland? Yes, I do. Do I think we became too fractious at times and too bogged down in culture war and identity politics? Yes. Have I done a lot of reflecting on, I suppose, my role in that and what I've learned? Yes. And that was even in the kind of latter stages of my time in the Parliament. So yeah, and my worry, I suppose, for this new Parliament is that we again get bogged down in a lot of that, and that people can't see where there is common ground and where there is opportunity to either work together, and whether that's in opposition or to work together with the government to actually try and push forward the issues that really matter to folk. And there's a lot of time that can be wasted in the Parliament. And actually, I thought it was quite refreshing to see what Kenny Gibson has chosen to do this week in terms of trying to fix those processes, trying to refresh them. I think that's important. What I would hope is that that's not where Kenny stops. I hope that he thinks about how does he drive forward culture, how does he drive forward how people use their time in the Parliament. I think that's what's going to be really important.
You mentioned their culture wars and identity politics and the amount of time spent on those things in the last 5 years. Is that a reference mainly to GRR?
I think, GRR was obviously the sort of the totemic sort of touchstone type moment, but there were other things as well where we just spent a lot of time of getting bogged down in those sort of wider issues, which obviously become really hurtful and really harmful. But actually, how do we find a common ground in these sorts of issues that are really complex and really difficult? And I was guilty, I think, at times of not seeing everyone's point of view or not trying to find more of a space to understand where people are coming from. And I think that's the first part, is how do you do more of that? We might never agree, and we might never be able to find the consensus that works for everyone. But I think we need to try and do more of that.
Do you think Labour made a strategic blunder on GRR and their support for it? Because obviously Anas Sarwar backpedaled on it, and he's now a strong supporter of single-sex spaces.
I think I'm on the record as saying I think we suspended our critical thinking, and we could have been more deliberate and considerate in terms of how that bill was going to work in practice, the amendments that we brought and secured, and whether that would have resulted in our support in the end. And I suppose, if you look at things like, we were the ones who were talking about the primacy of the Equality Act. Now, that's obviously moved on because of the court case and things, but it was, I suppose, the start of that sort of broader discussion about how does this all interact. So looking back and reflecting, I would have liked to see us probably be more discerning and understanding where that was going to lead to in terms of the legislation being passed.
Just finally, do you look at the Parliament and think that's a place I want to go back to in 2031, or do you want to do something else with your life?
Well, look, it's a strange experience losing your seat, because suddenly overnight you're unemployed, and a job that you loved is not yours to do anymore. And that's, I respect, as I say, the decision of the electorate in that regard. Politics for me is a cause, Paul. It's not a career. But if I had the opportunity to serve again, of course, I would put myself forward and hope to do that, because I've got more to say and hopefully more to give in that regard. What I do for the next 5 years, I'm not sure yet, but certainly I will have more to say about the future of the Labour Party, of the Scottish Labour Party, of our country. There are things as well that are in my life that are about public service that will be in my life regardless. The volunteering that I do in my local community, the folk that I try and support with lots of different issues, that doesn't go away just because you don't have an elected office. So absolutely. What I am worried about, though, is the polarisation of the Parliament. And my worry is that if we get into a situation where we have very, very polar opposites that just constantly are in conflict and can't find any common ground to advance the issues that matter to folk, I do worry about people's sort of belief in devolution and their belief in the Parliament as a vehicle for change. So if you think about 99, the great hope of the Parliament was about making Scottish solutions to Scottish issues. We look at some of the polling now about how people feel about the Parliament, and it really is quite stark in terms of, ongoing support for devolution. And I hope that, as I say, some of the reforms that Kenny's taking forward and some of that wider debate is about saying to people, look, this place has value. It's important to your life. It's important to engage in. And it's important that it can drive forward, the issues that you want to see dealt with.
Okay, thanks very much to Paul for joining me, and thanks also to the Daily Record video team who produced this episode. You can listen to this episode of Planet Holyrood on Spotify or Apple Podcasts, or watch it on the Daily Record YouTube channel. Don't forget to follow us on Instagram and TikTok for the latest news and the best bits of the podcast.
We will never turn our back on a single Scot.
We've got to wrestle with those challenges.
This is the same nonsense we have heard time and time again.
This is our country. Let's fix it together.